Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this video, I'm going to be talking about the full moon in Aquarius on the 12th of August. Now, this full moon is another supermoon, the last of the supermoons this year. And the reason we call it a supermoon is because it looms much larger in our sky because we're that much closer to it. Now, this full moon is also called the sturgeon moon because in the Great Lakes, and this is the Native Americans called it the sturgeon moon because there were many giant sturgeons caught at this particular time of the year. It's also called, I think by the Tlingit Indians of the Northwest Pacific, they call it the mountain shadow moon, which I think is not only a rather beautiful name for this full moon, but I think it's rather appropriate given that this full moon is conjunct Saturn. Now, I'm going to be talking about that in a little more detail shortly, but I also want to talk about the fact that this full moon ends a cycle that began on February the 1st with the new moon in Aquarius. So you might like to think back to that late January, early to mid-February period and see the things that began at that period or were current, were very much in your life, whether they were wonderful things and things that you were very excited about, or whether they were challenges and things you didn't like at all. Because this full moon closes that 6-month period. So either there is closure at that time in the sense that a project is completely finished, or you've reached a point where you think you can put it in a box and put it away, or it reaches a new stage. Whatever happens around that full or the forthcoming full moon in Aquarius is a time, as always, of closure and completion, this time with knobs on. And so, especially dating back to the February period, we can get to either move forward in a new way, on a new level with certain projects or relationship, whatever it may be, or we will decide, you know, it's had its lifespan, it's done and it's dusted. So what I'm going to do is immediately go to our horoscope, and so that we can see all the things that are happening around the time of the full moon, because of course that makes this full moon very different from the last full moon in Aquarius. It's how it's set against the background of the other planetary alignments that makes each full moon, each new moon different. And of course, I will be going through all 12 signs a little later on, pointing out the areas of the chart which are in focus with this full moon. Okay, so let's take a look at this particular full moon on paper. Now, as you can see that I have set this full moon from the perspective of Moscow. And I've done this for a particular reason, not only because we can see the full moon very clearly, the sun in the 9 o'clock position and the moon in the 3 o'clock position, straddling the ascendant-descendant axis, but we can also see quite clearly not only that the moon is up close and personal to Saturn, but also if we look at the degree, 19 degrees of Aquarius, 19 degrees of Leo, it is in fact 90 degrees away from Uranus, currently in that 12 noon position, which means that this full moon isn't just conjunct Saturn, but it's squaring Uranus. And next to Uranus, we have planet Mars. So Mars is also tied up to this configuration. And we can, you know, analyze this in terms of the actual period of time being one very unstable, lots of fireworks, whether we mean that in a good way or in a not so good way. And with Mars, we get sparks, we get clashes, we get conflict, we get breakthroughs, that Mars-Uranus conjunction. And we get a lot of other things that I'm going to talk about. Now, if we look at that Mars-Uranus conjunction, it was exact and will be exact, depending when you're looking at this video, on the 1st of August, which means that really from the last 8 days of July, that Mars-Uranus conjunction was building. Really and truly, from the new moon in Leo on the 28th of July, we kicked off one of the most important periods of 2022, if not the most important period of the year, a period that goes through to this full moon on the 12th of August, but actually extends a little bit beyond it to the end of the month, perhaps less intensely, but it's still there. And as I said, I'll explain a little bit more quite how this might manifest in a second. So Mars-Uranus conjunctions are always to do with the unusual, the unconventional, and the unexpected. So really, as we draw closer to the 1st of August, that time period, we can expect some breakthroughs of one sort or another, whether these are breakthroughs in strikes that are currently paralyzing a lot of Great Britain, whether it's breakthroughs in talks, where we look at these various parts of the world that are in conflict. And we also look in terms of, what science and is informing us, these ideas of how we look at our world in a very, very new way. And these are all very, very positive Uranian qualities. But we can't just look at the positive ones. We have to look at the negative ones. And this is therefore the beginning of a period of strife. Now, this can be an increase in so many of those situations that are in conflict. And around the time of that Mars-Uranus conjunction, individually, all of us, as we think about that conjunction, we need to take a little bit more care of how we go about the business of our lives. We want to be focused so that we don't trip up. And because Uranus has such a lot to do with technology, a lot to do with the internet, a lot to do with devices that are run by computer and software, this is a time when, oh yes, we might get some wonderful developments in software, but we're probably going to get a lot more unpleasant things as well. So we get power surges and problems with electricity. We get a lot of scamming going on. We get all sorts of things to do with outages, to do with the internet and hacking, everything to do with the internet, but in a negative way, we have to be very careful with. And so in practical terms, really, I would say throughout this period that I'm pointing to, 1st of August through to the 12th of August, if you're doing online banking transactions, or you're making purchases, or you're dealing with things that require the internet to carry out that transaction, be very, very careful. Now, in terms of, let's say, the war in Ukraine, for instance, this is going to get a lot more dramatic as we enter August. And I'm going to be looking at that specifically at the moment. But there are other pockets of difficulty in different parts of the world, whether it's China, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Australia. There's conflicts everywhere, not necessarily battle conflicts in the sense of a war like that, but conflicts between political parties and, those kind of battles. Not only is Mars conjunct Uranus at the beginning of the month, but it's also squaring Saturn 7 days later. And what we're seeing here right the way through the month, because by the end of August, we're seeing Venus treading in the same shoes, so to speak, as Mars. So Venus will be square Uranus and Venus will be opposing Saturn in the last couple of days of the month, 27th, 28th. And so, as I say, even though the most intense part of this important period of the year is up to the 12th, a little bit beyond maybe, But really and truly, we can't say it's completely over and out until we start in early September. Now, on the 8th of August, I think you can probably see where where we've got Venus. In this chart, we've got Venus at 0 degrees of Leo, but a few days before the full moon, on the 8th of August, she was opposing Pluto. And this also is an echo of the events and the experiences that we were having in the middle of July. And again, I want to take you back to Great Britain, where, of course, we had the resignation of the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and then that followed immediately by the beginnings of a race for the leadership, which got extremely ugly. So we're going to see a little bit more ugliness, I think, as we come to that 8th of August period. But I think we also have to think that in our own lives, especially if we have planets around the 26 degrees of the cardinal signs, Aries, Libra, and Cancer and Capricorn, that Venus plays a tune on our natal planets. So we have things that are challenging in our lives, whether they are events that are very important in a good way, or whether they're events that are not so welcome, but they still challenge us. That if you're in that group, then this period of August is also going to be quite a tumultuous one for you as well, but one where an enormous amount of good can be done. And of course, in terms of our growth, psychologically and spiritually, we're going to make giant strides thanks to these particularly powerful alignments. Now, a little bit further on, as we look at the full moon itself, we see that the full moon is applying to Saturn, and it will also have squared Uranus the day before. So we are really right in that dynamic here, where we have to accept the status quo and go forward in a new way from it, because Uranus is liberation. Saturn is, those restrictions that we have, keeping us tied to the past or tied to the rules and regulations. And that's going to be part of my theme for the conclusion this time as well. Uranus on the 24th, which covers our full moon period, is also important because it turns stationary retrograde. So we can say for about a week before that, that brings us to around the 14th, 15th of August, all things Uranus, which I've just been talking about, things to do with electronics and technology, are really going to be super important, whether in the sense of fresh new developments and new devices and breakthroughs on that, but also things to do with Google and Twitter and Facebook and TikTok, all these social media vehicles. These are going to be, in the center of, whether it's controversy or just through its developments, we're going to be seeing a lot to do with that as well. And then finally, towards the end of the month, as I mentioned, Venus will be treading in the footsteps of Mars. And so we're going to, and the Sun, and we're going to see Venus squaring Uranus and Venus opposing Saturn. But what I want to look at now, which is very important, if you remember, as I started this video to you, I talked about the link between the February new moon and the August full moon, and the developments and events that occurred around that time are now at completion. Well, of course, the most important thing that we're looking at here is we're looking at the war in Ukraine, because it was shortly after the full moon in Leo that Putin and his army invaded Ukraine. And in fact, that full moon was, as the Sun was square Uranus at that time, indeed, as it is at the time of this full moon, Sun square Uranus. Mercury square Uranus. So we've got a lot of echoes to this time. There is a sense of not necessarily having come full circle, because of course we're not at the new moon, but we are certainly at a crucial stage of this war in Ukraine. Could it be completed at this time? Well, I would say that the events during this period of early to mid-August are going to be decisive, one way or another. There's going to be a very decisive event that's going to play into the conclusion of this war, or the development of the war onto a whole new level, which is not really worth thinking of, in the sense that we could get other countries more drawn into this. And we don't really want to go there. We want to be as positive as we can about the portents as we look at them, but we can't knock out of the ballpark some escalation here, because there is a completion of a stage, as it has been really since the war began on the 24th of February. Another thing that I want to remind you about, if we go back to early February, on the 2nd of February, we had, or is it the 7th? I think it's the 2nd. We had Her Majesty's anniversary of her ascension to the throne. So she did that 70 years ago. So it was not only a very important part of the year, and a part of history, if you like, but also it wasn't very long after that that we were made aware of the Queen's very debilitating situation with her mobility, and where she is, so to speak, now, really we were awakened to this state of affairs. And the following sort of developments in the monarchy, with Charles and William taking over many, many more responsibilities, and of course Great Britain and the rest of the world actually being introduced to the idea that there will be a new guard at some point, and we might as well get used to it now, rather than having to do everything at that very sad moment when the Queen is no longer with us. So again, we're looking at this period of August for developments related to the Queen and the royal family, and we may even have further developments to do with Prince Andrew, and also we get Prince Harry as well. And this period covers Meghan's birthday. So there's going to be quite a lot of royal developments as we get into this halfway period of August. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this full moon, in the sense of what it means to Russia and Ukraine, because it is, well, perhaps not extraordinary how close the charts of Russia and Ukraine are, because of course Ukraine was formed in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we need to go back to that period of time. Let me just check out my years here. Yes, I'm right, 1991. For both the charts of Russia and of Ukraine. But the time and the date that that Russia became Russia and Ukraine gained its independence and became Ukraine as we know it, there were different dates that this happened. And when we look at the extraordinary connections, we can see that for Ukraine, we have the MC-IC axis in Scorpio, Taurus, and Pluto at 17 degrees of Scorpio, picking up a square to this full moon. And we see it with Russia as well. They have a Venus-Pluto conjunction at 22 and 21 of Scorpio, and that's on the MC-IC axis. We have to look at Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, who respectively have 21 of Leo and Aquarius on their midheaven, on their MC-IC axis. So we can see this full moon is colossally important to Russia, to Ukraine, to Vladimir Putin, and Volodymyr Zelensky. So the other thing that I would draw your attention to, and we can come back to me a little bit more here, is the fact that I remember seeing a news broadcast by one of the head of intelligence, I think, of Ukraine, or certainly someone in military intelligence, talking about the mid-August period being a most decisive period for Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. So quite how he knew that back in May, I can't explain, but it certainly fits with our astrology. So that is one area of the world I'm going to be watching with, with great concern, but certainly interest. And, just by the by, I think about Donald Trump's ascendant descendant axis, 29 of Leo, Mars at 26 of Leo, the midheaven at I think 21 of Taurus, Scorpio, right in the lines of this full moon as well. So something really big affecting him in this August period, whether that's something in his own personal life, or whether we look a little bit more closely at the idea of what the select committee hearings were all about and the blame firmly planted on Donald Trump's shoulders for causing the insurrection, whether or not at this time it is apparent that we go forward more with proceedings against him. We'll have to wait and see. But these are all possibilities for these kind of countries, individuals for whom this 21 to 25 degrees, 26 degrees of Leo, Aquarius, Taurus, and Scorpio is super important. So I'm going to move on now, and we're going to look at each sign of the zodiac and how this full moon is likely to affect you. So we're going to start with Aquarius because, of course, the full moon is in your sign, and that means the full moon is in your first house. So, of course, if you have Aquarius rising, then the full moon, or the moon itself, is going to be in your first house. And the first house is all about us personally. It's the most personal area of the horoscope. So it is about our personal ambitions, our desires, the things we put our personal stamp on. It's about our appearance. It's about our image, which aren't necessarily the same things. And I do discuss this a lot, the idea that our appearance is, how we look to everybody as we meet them and greet them. But of course, our image is something else. It's that, way we want to present ourselves, especially now that almost all of us have a social media platform. Then our image on that platform is all important. So the full moon here is really a way of saying, am I in need of an update? Does my image need an upgrade? And we can also think about things being faded out and dissolved, but in a good way. So much better to do things as a process over a period of time, as opposed to just doing them, snap. It's like too difficult. So anything that you realize is fading out, or you choose to fade, that you no longer want to be front forward in your personal life and with your image and all the things I'm just talking about, well, use the cycle of the full moon, if you like, the waning cycle, to really achieve that kind of ending, so that you can start that new beginning on the new moon in Virgo on the 24th of August. Now, in fact, another thing about this full moon for you, Aquarius, is that, of course, the sun is in your opposite sign, and therefore it's moving through the 7th house. So this for you is also an important time for relationships. And when we think that that's the sun is opposing Saturn, the moon is conjunct Saturn, it's squaring Uranus, we've got a really decisive time coming up, whether you decide you want to make a break from an organization, or it's a natural break from a period of time you spent with a group of people, or whether it's a little bit more important than that, and we're looking at a relationship of significance that ends at this time. But let's not forget, endings come before beginnings, new beginnings. So it's very important when we think of things that are ending, even if they're voluntary, we bring them to an end, we take time to honor that relationship, that situation that's ending, in order to be able to be free and clear to start our new beginnings. Now, this same piece of advice is also important for Leos. The sun is in your sign, so the sun is moving through your first house. So right through to through much of August, there's a lot of activity to do with your personal ambitions and your personal desires and things that you really want to have happen to you. And they're not, you know, part of a group experience or part to do with the children or anything like that. They're about you. And it is important that we get to understand what things are important for us. Because although we have all sorts of different roles in life, you know, we have a duty to ourselves to fulfill our ambitions and desires. And it's during the time the sun is moving through the first house that we get to really manifest those and to put efforts into it. But of course, for you too, we're looking at this whole area of relationships, because the full moon will be highlighting the axis of relationships. And the same applies to you too, in that it could be the ending of an important relationship. And this can be a working relationship. It does not have to be a romantic relationship. But there is something rather abrupt about this. And I am trying to steer the idea of trying to do this slowly and with dignity and with respect and honor. But you know, with Uranus in the mix, it's often very abrupt and unexpected and sudden. And of course, with Mars conjoining Uranus, it can be full of sparks as well. And sometimes, you know, I do say sometimes in my writings that, you know, sparks between a couple can set a relationship on fire in the best of ways, but it can send it up in smoke. And we are looking at this dynamic, Leo, when we look at this full moon in your, on the relationship axis, as I often call it. Now, for Scorpio, the full moon, the moon itself is in the 4th house. The sun is in the 10th house. So at the moment, the sun is moving through that area of the horoscope. It has a lot to do with your long-term goals. It also has a lot to do with your material world. It's where we meet the world. You know, in the 1st house, it's who we are, our personal stuff. But the 10th house is who we are out in the world. And to a certain extent, how we manufacture ourselves as in our role on the world stage, in our public lives. So for a lot of Scorpios, we're going to be looking at meetings and discussions related to your career, or things that you are putting together for your future. And these tend to be or have a material aspect to them. Money, objectivity, they're real. They're not sort of floating around there in the world of idealism. They're very real. So we look at this full moon and the moon in the 4th house, and we see 2 things here. We see the idea that, you know, once we reach an important conclusion, and remember that can be reaching an understanding or reaching an ending in regard to our job or something to do with our future, the building of our future, once we reach the end of a stage of that or the end of a project or whatever it may be, there is that sense of, you know, closure and completion that must occur in order for the new beginning to take place. But I also say, because this is to do with the home and family, if we're out in the world, as we often are, with the sun moving through this area of the horoscope, sometimes that's at odds with our home life and the amount of time we spend to our family or that we devote to family issues. So there could be a bit of a balancing act going on around the time of this full moon, maybe a bit of a crisis between, how much time is spent going forward and building things and doing things of a material nature, and how much we need to find that that kind of sanctuary in our home and coming close to home in the bosom of our family. There might be important events related to the family, related to the career, related to the home where we live, or in the way of perhaps ending a period of time we've spent in a particular home. Now, if we turn this on its head, when we come to Taurus, we know that the sun is moving through the 4th house at the moment and will do until the sun enters Virgo. And again, if you have Taurus rising, then the sun will be moving through your 4th house. Now, this becomes an important time for doing home stuff. Now, yes, that might mean painting and decorating. It might mean purchasing things for the home. It may mean all sorts of practical things to do with home life. But it can also be to do with the family itself. And perhaps it's this period of the year we tend to hook up with our family. There are family gatherings, there are events that are important to family life, whether that's anniversaries or weddings or christenings and those kind of things that bring the family together. So it's an important period for renewing family bonds. But of course, this is a full moon, and what happens at full moon? Well, often the reverse happens and we end up in conflict, especially with Mars and Uranus and Saturn and all those other things that I've been looking at. And so instead of happy families, we're having families in disunity. So it's something that needs watching. I mean, sometimes we can have a family upset and it clears the air and we, come together in a better relationship. And that's what we aim for in this, full moon season. But on some occasions, feelings are hurt and we can't find a bridge between two sets of views. And so it may mean that there is a period in which there is some separation. And remember, we're looking at family. But again, as I was talking to Scorpio about, there is this sense of balance in life. We need both. We need our life out in the world, but we need our sanctuary, our home, because that's where we move out to the world from. So if we come now to Aries, the full moon itself is in the 11th house, the sun in the 5th house. And the same, of course, if you've got Aries rising, you've got the full moon in the 11th house, the sun in the 5th house. And this is a very creative axis. It's the axis of creativity and collaboration, because while the sun is moving through the 5th house, we think in very personal terms about what we are creating of ourselves. In other words, what we put our heart and soul into. And that's a really important word, because the 5th house is ruled by Leo. It's the area of the heart. So heartfelt things happen in the 5th house. We give from our heart, which is why not only is it a creative area in the sense of what we do from our inner selves and produce in the outer self life, but it's also about the affair or the affairs of the heart, romances, things like that. But of course, this creative area, the sun moving through the creative area, is also about procreativity. So it's about our offspring, if we have them, or becoming pregnant, or new babies, or all sorts of things surrounding birth and pregnancy. And what I think is also interesting is that hopefully if you do become pregnant, or pregnancy and childbirth and new arrivals are part and parcel of this period of August, that we think about the pleasure and joy and romance of it all that began this new life, which is why the 5th house is all about the heart. So the 11th house, the moon being in the 11th house, means that we're now looking at collaboration a little bit more importantly. So it's one thing to do something off your own bat and to be creative from your own inner muse, so to speak. But in the 11th house, we work with others. We, not only are more entrepreneurial in the 11th house. So for some Arians, this is about an entrepreneurial venture. Maybe it's the end of an entrepreneurial venture, or maybe it's the end of an important period for an entrepreneurial venture. But we also do things in groups when we're in a social setting. So this is also about important developments linked to people, and perhaps those we interact with socially. Has a lot to do with group consciousness as opposed to personal consciousness. So it's thinking in terms of the benefits of the group. Take it out a little bit further. We think about humanity. We think about everyone in the world. What benefits the world? What crises are there in the world that we can contribute in a good way to alleviating? So this full moon for you, Aries, is a time of assessment. Yes, you may be concluding a particular venture, maybe even concluding a love affair, but it's also about reaching conclusions about how, in a way, it's so important to work with others, to share ideas and things with other people. We're stronger in a group than we are as individuals. That may be what the full moon is telling you by the events that happen at this time. So if we come to Libra, we've got the opposite in play, really. The sun is moving through the 11th house. So you've got quite an extended period of thinking about how you can perhaps improve certain aspects of your life by collaborating with others. It's a time to join groups, a time to for teamwork within the work sphere. And I think also working as a team is incredibly important, even as a relationship, especially a romantic relationship or a relationship like marriage. Things work much better when you're working as a team. So not only does the sun give you an extended period moving through this area in order to be able to think more in terms of teamwork, but when the full moon comes along, as it does on the 12th of August or the 11th of August, depending where you are in the world, then this does become an opportunity to really understand the benefits of other people's involvement in your life work, if you like, the things that you consider are creative endeavors. Now, it may be there's a bit of a crisis here, as there often is at full moon, and we've only got to look at the full moon conjunct Saturn squaring Uranus to know that maybe the whole idea of an endeavor is in crisis, either because there's not of you enough in it and too much of other people, or the other way around. There's too much of you and not enough of other people. And you can extend that out, not just to the area of, businesses and, all of that, but really to things in life in general that are partly to you and partly, when we work or are together with other people. And Libra, I know what a diplomat you are and how, you come at relationships with such a kind of diplomatic and fair-minded attitude, but you're a cardinal sign. And, if things aren't going the way you want them to, and other people are getting in the way of it, well, you're going to say something. And that might be that at that full moon. But remember, Uranus and Saturn, if there is a break or there is an upset, it might well be long-lasting. In fact, maybe difficult to create a bridge back to that endeavor or that relationship. So if we come to Cancer, we've got the moon itself in the 8th house. And this area of the horoscope is, I would say, a very misunderstood area. We think of it in terms of death and rebirth, and it is ruled by Scorpio, this house, so that's where we get the idea of the phoenix rising from the ashes. And we get this idea of reinvention and something ending in order for something new and shiny to come out of it, skin shedding. But in the 8th house, we get a bit stuck there thinking, oh, it's a house of death. Does that mean there's going to be a death? Or does it mean that, something rather dark and nasty is going to happen to me? Well, not at all. I mean, we think about the darknesses within ourselves, and the darkness in ourselves is really what we don't want to see, the things that we feel really very fragile about. We're not too happy about them, and they become very inferior, and we get a bit scared of them. But really, by confronting our fears, which is what you should always do if you've got an 8th house, something going on in your 8th house, you need to confront your fears. And that way, we find they're manageable, they're not so scary. But of course, the sun at the moment will be moving through the 2nd house of the horoscope. So when we think about the 2nd house, it's where we build things, where we it's our material world again, but in what we earn more than anything. It's the income that we have. It's things that are done very much from the self. And with the 8th house, it's where we share things. We share our income. We receive. It's a house of receiving what we receive from others. It's a house of receivership, even all those kind of words we can play around with. So the full moon may be about a crisis in a financial arrangement, a financial crisis, period. But it's something that can be resolved by looking at it, bringing it into the light and dealing with it. And it may be that some agreements need to be at an end. You need to end those agreements in order to be free to pursue new ones and to be free of the burdens that financial arrangement or that relationship is actually causing you. Remember again to look at Uranus as it figures in this full moon, as well as Saturn, because things need to end in order for liberation to occur. So this particular time, Cancer, it may be time to end financial agreements, whether they're with credit card companies and mortgage lenders, that'd be a good thing, or whether it's with partnerships, romantic, marital partnerships or business partnerships. Maybe an ending is here, maybe a settlement is due, maybe even an inheritance is forthcoming as portrayed by this full moon. We have a similar kind of dynamic working here for Capricorn, only of course the sun is moving through the 8th house, so it's an extended period where all 8th house matters are to the fore. So it is a time to consider, what your financial relationships are and whether they're, conducive to growth or whether they're quite the reverse. And this is a time maybe where you should be thinking about getting rid of some of those financial relationships. Here, when we look at that full moon, we see not only the potential for some kind of financial crisis or some financial conclusion, but we can be looking at things like a big, some kind of transaction, financial transaction that's really going to make a big difference to you financially. So this could mean perhaps the sale or purchase of a home, which is probably the biggest purchase most of us made, but it could be some other purchase. So what you do on this full moon is sign a contract. It's done and it's dusted. But let's not forget that this full moon is a tricky full moon, conjunct Saturn, square Uranus. And so it may be that a contract you thought was forthcoming is no longer going to go through. Well, at least in the shape that it was or is. It needs changing. Maybe that's all it needs for it to come together at another occasion and go through. But these are all, issues for Capricorn and Cancer to really mull over at this period of time, through August, as well as the more significant moment of the full moon on the 12th. We come to our final group, the mutable signs. We come to Pisces. Now for you, this full moon is in the 12th house. So the sun is in the 6th house, the moon in the 12th house. And of course, if you've got Pisces rising, the moon is in the 12th house, the sun currently moving through your 6th house. So the focus for the sun is doing the work of life. So there's a lot of boxes being ticked and things being, loose ends being snipped. We're getting sort of sorted in our lives. And part of that sorting process is to do with our health as well. So health is always important when the sun is moving through the 6th house. It's where we think about it a little bit more. Are we eating the right foods? Are we practicing the right kind of practices? What is the general state of our health? Could we do with a little MOT? And certainly at the time of the full moon, Pisces, then the things that you're not paying attention to, that you need to pay attention to, are likely to be front forward. So if you've got an injury and you've been putting off going to see the doc, saying, oh no, I can put up with it. Well, probably around the time of the full moon, you'll be saying, you know what, I've got to get something done about this. So my advice to you would be to start sorting out dental problems, injuries, all those kind of things well in advance of the full moon, because they're going to feel a lot worse at the time of the full moon. But of course, this is also a very spiritual full moon, Pisces. So it's at this time, not only is your spiritual self key to handling the various events in your life, so they all need looking at from a spiritual perspective, but it's also a kind of moment where great spiritual awakenings can occur. Remember, we've got Uranus in the mix. So the idea of being opened, and even if you don't think in terms of your spiritual self, you want to think of higher consciousness and being awakened to a whole new way of looking at something. That's certainly something to take away from this full moon. So in a nutshell, we need to be looking at health, mind, body, and spirit, and also this idea of awakenings. So Virgo, for you, the full moon itself is in the 6th house, and so that's much more a sort of day-to-day event, isn't it? It isn't a long period. What's happening to you, of course, is that the sun is moving through the 12th house in preparation to come into your sign a little later on in August. So for you, this is a period of preparation, all the way through this part that I'm addressing on this video. It's a time of dissolution. So you're looking back on the year and thinking about all the sorts of things that have happened. And some of those things may still need processing. We can't keep going on with some of the things that have either hurt us tremendously or been a very dominant event in our lives, because we need to be free to move forward and experience new things. So it's this idea, while the sun is moving through the 12th house, that we sort of process those events that have been both difficult and unwelcome, and those that may have been rather good for us. But we need to start with a clean slate in a way when the sun comes into our own sign. And so that's what should be happening, a period of preparation and also of recharging the batteries. When the sun comes into our own sign, we should be re-energized. And that's partly up to us as well, because we need to prepare for that. So mentally, spiritually, physically, we need to, replenish, restore. And part of that process might be to spend some time in retreat. Now, we may not be fortunate enough to be able to go on a retreat to somewhere in our world, and we're away from people and, the hurly-burly of life, although that would be ideal. But we can at least take some moments to do just that in our busy day, to address time to ourselves, to sleep more, to pay a little bit more attention to our inner world. And that's the process going on all the way through August until the sun comes into your own sign. So here we have the full moon. So we get full blast, all those things I've been talking about. But we also have endings, conclusions to be drawn. On a practical level, it may be the end of treatment. If you've been undergoing treatment for something, this full moon indicates the end of that course of treatment. It could be related to work. So perhaps a particular project at work is now completed. You're ready to move on to something else. Or it could mean you're at the end of a job. That's it. It's done. I think this area of the chart is also about where we find a lot of purpose in our lives. So this full moon could be a bit of a crisis over that. What is the meaning of my life? You know, what purpose am I here for? So that might come up during the course of this full moon and the waning cycle. And obviously the answer will be individual to you. I can't give you that answer, but it's an important question. If we come now to Gemini, we get the full moon in the 9th house, which means the sun is in the 3rd house. And on the 3rd, 9th axis, we travel. So my goodness, is this a time for travel? I mean, in the Northern Hemisphere, and I guess quite in the Southern Hemisphere too, we do a lot of long haul travel in the summer months. And this year, because of all the problems with airlines and strikes and COVID, you name it, we've got everything but the kitchen sink thrown at travel. There could be some problems, particularly at full moon time, about your holidays or about your travel arrangements. And if you are indeed traveling on the 11th, 12th, 13th or 14th, then it would be wise to build in a little bit more time for your journeys and a little bit more stress. But really, this whole period, when you think the sun is moving through your 3rd house, so travel is an issue, with a full moon, which brings long haul travel into the mix, then there could be any period of time in this, block of early to mid-August where there are going to be problems with travel. And of course, with extreme heat, as we're learning, the rails, the railway lines buckle. So there could be other reasons why we have problems with travel. It doesn't just have to be air travel, and particularly at the time of the full moon. But what I would also say to you, Gemini, is with the sun moving through the 3rd house for an extended period, this is really your time to study. And it means perhaps to get a new skill under your belt. It doesn't have to be, a year-long study. It can be a weekend course. It can be something geared to giving you extra skills, but also your knowledge of the world, your interaction with your community, your neighborhood. These might be particularly important and worthy of your attention during August anyway, but there could be, of course, all sorts of changes in your immediate vicinity, whether there are roadworks, whether there are events that block up streets or areas of your town or wherever you may be. So it's important to be abreast of what the community is doing and to participate if you can. We get a lot from working with our community. But the full moon per se is a little bit more about conclusions. So we've talked about stresses with travel. We're also going to be talking about reaching conclusions, some of them with a kind of legal association. There could be judgments delivered around the time of the full moon, whether they release you and you're happy about it, or whether you feel they've sort of changed the status quo in a not so good way, is going to vary from Gemini to Gemini. But there is this sort of hint of things coming to a point where a judgment can be made. And if you can work around that kind of phraseology, you'll be quite near to the meaning of the full moon in your case. Now, if we look for Sagittarius, the sun is moving through your 9th house. So we've got this extended period through end of July, right through to late August, where there's a lot to do with other countries international affairs, travel, and very much what I said to Gemini, that, you know, particularly around the time of the full moon. So we're looking at the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th. This could be a real problem for travel. And you just, you know, need to take a little bit more time for your journeys and come with a few more supplies, especially if you're traveling with children. If you get delays and cancellations and all that that's been going on pretty well through the summer, you know, you really will want to bring things, especially for the little people, and also for those who aren't quite so fit and strong. And I think the idea really of the time the sun is moving through the 9th house, we definitely look beyond our small world. It's the bigger world that we're looking at. It's not quite the same as the 11th house, where we consider humanity as a whole and the interests of humanity. The 9th house is a little bit more philosophical than that, but it's also quite geographical as well. So we're looking at different countries, the events going on in different parts of the world, and your participation or the way you are entering into what may be happening in different parts of the world. That's as we go through the 9th house, that's what's happening. But let's also think that the 9th house is academia. And what also happens in August is that the results come in of the all-important exams, if you're 16 or you're 18 or 19, and then the results of these exams can tell you where the next stage of your academic life is going to be, whether you've got great results or not so great results. So that full moon is going to be a surprise. You know, there's a surprise, whether that's a great surprise and you think, wow, I did really much better than I thought, or, oops, what happened there? Remember, this full moon as a whole is one of shock and awe. And, you know, you'll meet that full moon and its events when you get there. But these are the areas of life that we are particularly looking at. So we've gone through all 12 signs, and of course the signs are the houses as well. You know, as you can see when I talk about the first house and so on. But now a lot of the things that have come up during the course of the conversation, especially the idea of reaching conclusions and there being liberation in that, is sort of played in a little bit to my conclusion on this video. And what I wanted to talk about loosely was Chiron. And the reason I've chosen Chiron is linked to the Saturn-Uranus dynamic, because throughout August, Saturn and Uranus are again quite closely in square. You know, a little less, they're a little more than 90 degrees away, but they're still very much in square. And we've been suffering from or benefiting from this arrangement since the beginning of 2021. So we're getting a lot of play on those principles of restrictions and rules and liberation and protest and all the things that have gone on. You think about the main events in different countries have really reflected this push against bureaucracy, push against regimes that are restrictive, and the desire for liberation and democracy has been a strong theme. And we think about our own lives where we've been submitted to conditions which are very restricting, and we feel suppressed by our conditions, and we want to break through and find our freedom. That's the nature of the Saturn-Uranus square, the Saturn-Uranus dynamic. Well, we can't say that's the nature of Chiron, because Chiron isn't a planet, it's an experience. It's a journey. But the reason it has a Saturn-Uranus flavor to it is that as this centaur object that lies just outside our solar system, it comes in through or just in the orbit of Saturn and goes out again past Uranus. So this is why it's called a Saturn-Uranus object. So is particularly relevant to the month of August. And for those of you who are interested in Chiron, at the moment it's about 16 degrees of Aries, if you're interested. Doesn't play into our full moon video so much, but what I'm going to be talking about most certainly does. Now, I said a moment ago that Chiron isn't a planet, so it doesn't have a kind of set of attributes, like, for instance, Venus, the planet of love, the planet of form, finance, all those things we associate with Venus, or Mars, which is conflict and desire and ambition and courage and all those things. It isn't a personality planet. What it is an experience or a journey, and it relates to the myth of Chiron, the wounded healer, who was a great healer and a great teacher. But the wound he sustained from Hercules' arrow, which had been dipped in the Medusa's blood, he could never heal. He couldn't heal his own wound. He could heal everyone else, but he couldn't heal his own. So we all have Chiron in our charts, and therefore where it is in our charts is telling us where we bear our wound. And it's a lifelong wound. We don't get over it. But the important thing is, what we do is learn to manage it. And that really is the theme of my conclusion, really, this idea that sometimes it's a bridge too far to think we're going to get over something, or we're going to achieve something that keeps being denied us, or we keep being hurt by, or wounded by the thing that causes us existential pain, emotional pain, intellectual pain, physical pain. We have to manage it by looking at it in that way and learning the best way to manage it becomes actively working with our wound, working with our hurt. Whereas if we keep saying, or keep trying very hard to get over it. Okay, we're going to get over this. Mind over matter. We're going to do this. It's very soul destroying to find that no matter how much work we do, we're still running up into the same set of circumstances. We can't seem to fix it. So we learn how to manage ourselves in this. Now, if we think of Chiron in physical terms, a physical wound, well, maybe it is a wound that, isn't going to heal that easily. We have to bear that wound all our lives. For instance, if we have some terrible accident and we lose a limb, well, we can't replace that limb, but we can learn how to manage it. And that becomes the goal. And people live great lives without a limb, for instance. So we have to use that allegory, that metaphor, to apply for the things that we don't seem to be able to get in our lives, and we believe we can't do without. The existential pain we suffer, we have to manage it in another way. The same really with a terminal illness. It isn't going to change. We know that this is the route through which we are going to leave this world and move to the next. So we need to manage that, whether in terms of pain management and medication, but also we need to get our head around it, come to peace with it, which is why I think that at heart, our existential wound is about honoring it, wearing it as a badge of honor, not as something we want to hide away from and hide away from others. It's a badge of honor. It's something we should respect. And each one of us has an existential wound of some description. And yes, we should be able to discover, what it relates to and its many, many roots and causes, which will amplify our understanding of it and help in the process of our managing it. But I think if we stop this, I'm going to overcome it one day, and think, you know what, I'm going to manage this with greatness. I'm going to make it work for me. I'm actually going to use it. That's the way we need to look at it. So thank you for watching. I hope you've taken a lot away from it. And I look forward to speaking to you, seeing you in a couple of weeks' time. Bye for now.